All right, welcome to The Explainer. So the US just dropped a bombshell, threatening to slap massive new tariffs on India. Now, normally, in any other trade fight, this would cause absolute panic. But India's reaction? It's been, well, really quiet. So let's figure out what's going on.
Yeah, this is the real head-scratcher, isn't it? The US announces a 50% tariff on everything from India. I mean, that's the kind of move that's supposed to shake an entire economy to its core. And yet, India isn't flinching. It's like they're totally unbothered. So, what's their secret? What do they know that the rest of us don't?
Okay, so first things first, let's really break down what the US actually did here. Because, this wasn't just some tiny tweak to trade policy, it was a huge escalation. 50%. Just let that sink in for a second. This isn't your standard negotiating play. No, this is a sledgehammer. A tariff this high, slapped on all goods, it's practically unheard of in modern trade. This is a move designed to do one thing: inflict as much economic pain as possible to force India's hand. And get this, the official reason from the White House? It's not about trade deficits or unfair practices. It's pure geopolitics. They're saying, point blank, that these tariffs are because India is still buying Russian oil. And just like that, this whole thing stops being about economics and starts being about who's on whose side in a much bigger global game.
All right, so a 50% tariff threat. You'd expect chaos, right? Panic in the markets, politicians screaming. But instead, India's response was, well, shockingly calm. And honestly, that's where this story gets really interesting. So our first big clue comes from the stock market. I mean, a threat like this should have sent investors scrambling. But what actually happened? India's main stock index, the Sensex, barely budged. It dropped less than 1%. That's not panic. That's confidence. And here's the kicker. Politically, this whole thing seems to have totally backfired on the US. It actually brought India's political parties, who are usually at each other's throats, together. You have the main opposition leader coming out and calling it economic blackmail. When that happens, it gives the government this incredible unified front. They've got the public support to stand firm.
So where does all this confidence come from? Well, to really get it, you gotta follow the money. We need to do the math. Okay, so this is where it gets really fascinating. It all boils down to a pretty stark calculation. Analysts figure the worst-case scenario from these tariffs is a $23 billion hit to the economy. That's a lot. But caving to just one of the big US demands, like opening up the market to American dairy, would cost India's own farmers about $20 billion. So when you look at it that way, taking the tariff hit suddenly doesn't seem so crazy, does it? And if you look at who would get hit the hardest, yeah, the impact is real. We're talking billions of dollars of risk for electronics, for gems and jewelry. But here's the key. The pain is spread out. There's no single industry that's so dependent on the US that these tariffs would be a total knockout blow. It's more like a bunch of body blows instead of one big punch. But here's India's real economic superpower. Its ultimate shield. It's not its exports. It's its own gigantic domestic market. Think about it. Over 60% of the entire economy is driven by people in India buying things in India. So while exports are important, for sure, the economy has this massive built-in cushion that just softens the blow from any trade war. And there are even more layers to this defense. For starters, about 40% of all the trade between the US and India is in services, things like IT support and consulting. These tariffs don't even touch that. And fun fact, the US actually has a trade surplus with India in services. Then you've got the currency effect. A weaker rupee could actually make Indian goods cheaper over time, helping to cancel out some of the tariff damage. The whole picture is just way more complicated than it looks. But, this whole thing isn't just about spreadsheets and economic models. This is also a super high-stakes game of diplomatic chess, and it's being played on a global board. And if you look at it from India's perspective, they're probably thinking, hey, what more do you want? I mean, they've already been making some pretty big concessions. They've cut taxes on stuff like American motorcycles and bourbon. They literally paved the way for Tesla to set up shop. They got rid of that controversial Google tax. And get this, they've massively ramped up how much oil they buy from the US. Their argument is basically, we've been negotiating in good faith this whole time.
And India isn't just playing defense. They're pushing back hard. They're basically calling out what they see as U.S. hypocrisy. The Indian Foreign Ministry has been pointing out, very publicly, that America's own trade with Russia hasn't exactly stopped. And that move, that's a direct shot. It challenges the entire moral high ground the U.S. is trying to claim for these tariffs.
So, is India just sitting around waiting? Not a chance. They're making moves on the global stage. We're seeing plans for the Prime Minister's first visit to China in years. The National Security Advisor is heading to Russia for talks, and they're looking at suing at the World Trade Organization. This is not what a country that feels backed into a corner does. So what's the end game here? Where is this all heading? Well, that brings us to the final and maybe the most crucial piece of this whole puzzle. And it all comes down to one thing: a waiting game.
Okay, the timeline is absolutely critical to understanding this. The U.S. order started a 21-day countdown clock. But look what's happening during that same 21-day window. There are potential, super high-stakes talks scheduled between the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine. For India, this is huge. Everything, literally everything, could change in just a few weeks.
And that right there, that's India's end game. Think about it. If those big talks between the US and Russia actually work, if there's some kind of breakthrough on Ukraine, then the entire justification for these tariffs on India, poof, it could just vanish overnight. So that gives India this incredibly powerful reason to just wait. Why would you give up something permanent, like market access, to solve what could turn out to be a very temporary political issue? Which brings us to a really interesting final question. You know, we usually think of power in these big global showdowns as being about who can be the most aggressive, who can act the fastest. But what if India's playbook is showing us something else, a different kind of power, the strength that comes from having the economic and political resilience to just wait it out? So in a world of high-stakes trade wars, maybe strategic patience isn't a sign of weakness. Maybe it's the ultimate power move.